In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian philosophy passed over directly into the body of an already existing Semitic religion which absorbed it. The blending of the two seemed to be the reuniting of two streams that originally flowed from a single source rather than the marriage of two independent systems. The Sumerians may not themselves be the originators of the philosophic system we associate with them, but they brought it into the light of history as we know it. Probably we have still to find the people in the culture in whose midst civilization grew up, and from whom both the Sumerians and the peoples of the Indus Valley, and also the peoples of Akkad, received it in a yet more distant past than that which has been traced back to Mesopotamia. The pseudo-historical chronological systems of the Mesopotamians, the Indians, and the Egyptians, not to mention the Chinese, bear traces of having been borrowed from that very rationalization of which we have spoken. The reigns of the 10 and 8 antediluvian kings of the Sumerians and Babylonians, as the 6 days of the Old Testament creation, the yugas of India, the 30 dynasties of Egypt, and the imperial reigns of ancient China, as set out in literary texts, are all of them allegoric serializations of the manifestation which we call creation, and which, as the yuga proportionate divisions indicate, are intended to shadow forth the time element in manifestation, and more particularly the phases of it represented by our notions of past and present. The acceptance of these allegoric mensurations of time, which denoted that which was and is, as being literal records of actual historic events, has resulted in chaos in regard to the timescale worked out by archaeologists for the relative evolution of culture in the various centers of ancient civilization. In that timescale, all has been based on an identification, or to be more accurate, on 3 varying identifications of a Sothic cycle with the supposed period of King Menes of Egypt. A Sothic cycle consisting of the 1460 years that elapse between the heliacal risings of the star Sothis, that is, Sirius, that correspond accurately with the conventional dating of such a rising on the first day of the first month of each year of 360 days in the Egyptian calendar system. It is recognized that Menes was not the name of an actual pharaoh, but it has not been realized that the first 12 dynasties, at all events, are ideal time divisions, and that the royal family, identified by Alexandrian scribes with the 18th of these 30 divisions, probably succeeded directly the royal family identified with the 12th. Although the evidence of art and archaeology itself clearly points to it. The juxtaposition of the 12th and 18th would make hay of the arbitrary timescale of the archaeologists, and a wreck such as that sometimes seems to be a greater catastrophe to the scholastic mind than keeping truth in blinkers. Someday, the discovery of a new Palace of Minos by another Evans, and the finding of a new Rosetta Stone enabling still undeciphered scripts, such as those of Crete and the Indus Valley, to be read, may throw a flood of light on the first home of civilization, and on the earlier stages by which mankind arrived at the concept of creation as something serialized in past, present, future cycle, ruled by the logic of numbers. In the Egyptian allegories and in the ritual recorded in the Book of the Dead, there is a plenty of testimony to the derivative character of these allegories from the ancient and logical system of Mesopotamia. It is curious, though, that it may be mere coincidence that the name of King Menes, in its Greekized form, resembles so closely the Greek form mina, from manna, of the basic cubic measure of the Sumerian rationalization of mensuration, from which everything else derives. Namely, the jin, a 60th part, which is also a unit, since the number 60, a crossing, one might say, between the number 6 and the number 10, was not only unit but also whole in the Sumerian system, and was the sacred number given to their first principle, An, of which the begetting mother, Nin Anna, or Amma Me, was simply the feminized expression. It is even conceivable that the Aramaic writing on the wall, that in the Hebrew scripture the Jewish prophet Daniel was the only sage at the Babylonian court to decipher, had its explanation in some occult reference to the minau, the counting out and measured off doom that was time. For there are many traces of the old Sumerian cosmic philosophy, not only in the Gnostic system of the Mandeans, but in the Gnosticism of the Jewish Kabbalah, so much of which has a strong affinity with portions of the Book of Daniel, compiled in the 2nd century BC, and also with Ezekiel, also a late book, and with the revelation of St. John the Divine in the Christian New Testament. The loss of the conviction of multiple unity, together with the loss of the conviction of compassion, it's patent in the patriarchal Orthodox religion of the Jews of the time of Christ, despite the inclusion in their canonical scriptures of so much of the poetic expression of the old Mesopotamian cosmic religious philosophy. The gain in poetry in the actual telling of the creation drama multiplied 100-fold, and it is, by our beautiful English translation, it is great, but the loss in logical meaning is perhaps greater. The Semites seem to have shared the cosmic philosophy of the Sumerians, which regarded the moon and the sun, and such stars signified as moon and sun by reason of the position in the stellar heaven of these luminaries at different times and seasons, for example, Venus as the precursor and herald of the sun, as being in a special way the demonstrators of the orderly procession of time, which was the manifestation of the God, One. The oldest name for God of the northern Hebrew tribes, for instance, was El, or, when the name signified the one in the many, Elohim. And this name, with its derivatives, Ilah, Il, and Allah, originally was applied to the One, more particularly as that One was manifested by the traveler, or the regulator of time, the moon, or that other lord of time, the sun. The Sumerian equivalent for El was Zuen, or Sin, from which the mountain range of the Sinai, seat of the worship of El and of Yahweh, apparently took its name. This god, One, was called by the southern Hebrew tribes Yah, or Yahweh, or Yod-He-Vav, and in the sacred writings of the Jews, this consonantal combination was extended into a verbal form having the meaning, he who causes to be. But they read it aloud as Adonai, Lord. Kabbalist mystics made a great deal of the sacred name which no man must utter, since to utter or create was the prerogative of God alone, and no mere mortal could thus create God without blasphemy. To these mystics, the name was made up of the 4 consonants Yod, He, Va, He, the mysterious tetragrammaton, or 4-lettered word. There was a numerical significance in this, best understood by reference to the Pythagorean tetrachus, and to the idea inherited from Sumerian cosmic allegoric teaching of creation being expressed in time as well as spatially. Of this symbol was the cube, and more especially the cubed Sumerian foot, which was also the basic standard from which all mensuration started, called the jin, or mana, or Greek mina, a unit that was at the same time a 60th and also 60, being the unit that signified the first principle, an, also personified by the goddess Mineu, the Semitic verb from the Hebrew meni, to count, allot, measure off, or regulate. Hence used the image of the prime regulator and measurer of the moon, and thus by a natural transition of destiny. Hence, too, in the course of time, the shears of fate. Mineu was also one of the titles of Ishtar, the Semitic name for Inini, or Inanna, who is thus equated with the first principle of being. It was so that these early thinkers expressed their profound belief that divine law, manifesting as number, was an integral part of the absolute. The fourfold proportionate relationship of the periods of time, comprising a past and a present that are known, a future that is to be and is unknown, and then something transcending the notion of time that is expressed in creation, and which implies a beginning again, is a feature of all the cosmic philosophies deriving from the Sumerian, or perhaps we should say from the as yet unknown parent of the Sumerian cosmic philosophy. The linkage with the spatial universe through the motions of the heavenly bodies is an attempt to show that time and matter are but two faces of one fact, the fact that the utterance, by the one God, of all that we sum up in the word creation, or rather more, since we have come to associate the word with a definite moment in time past, whereas all Oriental thought conceives it as something continuously taking place. The cosmic ideas of the Kabbalist mystics in connection with the fourfold name have been held to be late borrowings from the Arabs and the Greeks, or the Egyptians, but it seems much more probable that they were ideas that had been kept alive from a much earlier period, when they were borrowed, along with the allegories of Genesis, from Mesopotamia, and possibly revived during the captivity and certainly reinforced during the sojourn in Egypt. The struggle of all the Semites to preserve intact the oneness of their God may have begun in a defensive movement against the kind of popular ignorance that loses sight of the reality in its veneration for the symbol. The monotheistic tendency degenerated into a fanatical exclusiveness in which the Hebrew God alone, and none other but he, was God, and in which the one God manifested in the many, venerated by other peoples, was not God at all, being in fact invisible to the Hebrews, who saw only the symbols which other ignorant populaces no doubt came to idolize. The same sort of thing is not unknown today, not only among the ignorant masses who are adherents of certain Eastern religions, but also among the ignorant masses who are adherents of the Christian faith. Are not the communal troubles in India, at bottom, founded in religious jealousy between the Mussulmans, wow, there's a dated term, who proclaim that Allah is one, and the Hindus who claim that God is both one and many? The terrible egoism of man, when he claims that he alone is able to see God, is indeed one of the prime factors of human disunity, of treachery to God, the Father of all men, and to man's own brother man, and should have been impossible had the pioneers of our civilization been able to impress on posterity the conception of their seers and poets of the unity of Supreme Being and his universe, and of the essentially compassionate character of the Creator manifesting in creation. The very wealth of the imagery of these pioneers seems to have militated against it. Mankind, as partner in man's own evolution with the Creator, has created exclusive gods in his own exclusive image, and fallen down and worshipped them. He has failed to use his creative, imaginative power, which he derives from the Supreme Creator, in harmony with the divine composition, and has called up those negations of unity, illusions, devils, and discord. The same loss of the idea of unity, of its concomitant compassion, is to be seen in the cults of the Romans, and also in the worldly sophistication of the Greeks, whose cultured writers and artists remembered only the pantomime figures inherited from Babylonia, Egypt, and India. For the most part, they slyly jeered at them, or used them as the dramatis personae of graceful literary tales, as, for example, the delightful fantasy of Cupid and Psyche contained in the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, along with other translations from the Greek. The religious content of that particular fantasy had evaporated, and Apuleius included it because the conceit was too delightful to be left out of one or another of his books. It once had meaning. A modern writer, almost as felicitous, has produced a charming fantasy upon the life of Christ, in which there would appear to be some grains of historical truth. The truth, however, strangely come by. George Moore, in his book The Brooke Kerith, takes seriously the theme of Jesus of Nazareth's sojourn among the Essenes. Ginsberg's rather little arid essay dismisses Josephus's hint that they resembled the Pythagoreans by such misleading arguments as the Pythagoreans were polytheists and the Essenes were monotheistic Jews. Josephus notes that they loved one another more than the other kinds of Jewish philosophers did, and that they took great pains in studying the writings of the ancients. At the reappearance of the sun, they said the Jewish prayer of the Chassidim, or Old Believers, still in use, in which occur the phrases, Lord of the universe, in thy great mercy have mercy upon us. O Lord, be thou praised. Be thou great in wisdom, who hast ordained and created the rays of the sun. The infinitely good has formed a glorious testimony for his name. He surrounded his majesty with luminaries. Benign are the luminaries which our Lord hath created. He has formed them in wisdom, intelligence, and understanding. Filled with splendor and brightness, their glory illuminates all the world. Rejoicing in rising and joyous in setting, they perform with awe the will of their Creator. He called the sun, and light rose. He saw and shaped the form of the moon. The Essenes were said to be compassionate, and they were called Nazarites. An unprejudiced reading of the Gospels in light of the comparative religious studies does suggest the probability that Jesus, perhaps in Egypt, had been profoundly influenced by the more ancient wisdom of the East. He regarded himself as the second Adam, and Adam, borrowed by the Jews from the Mesopotamian allegory, was an allegoric figure for mankind, in the cosmic poems which represented creation dramatically. That is to say, as something that had taken place at some point in time, whereas philosophically, creation was regarded as the manifestation of the one that continued to take place pari passu, with the unfolding of time itself. Incidentally, the Son of Man was an expression used of this typical figure of mankind in the book of Daniel, in the older part of the book forming a collection of dreams and visions. It occurs in chapter 7, where Daniel's vision of the Ancient of Days, a recognizable Jewish version of the Mesopotamian figure for time, which, for convenience, is usually given the Greek title Chronos, who is identified with El, is a curious medley of Babylonian pictures, such as would be conceded, I think, by any psychologist, to have the authentic marks of a dream vision. And I would add the dream of a certain type of dreamer whose imaginative life is so vivid and undisciplined that the frontiers between daydream and actual observation, and between daydream and night dream, are almost obliterated. That makes me think a little bit of The Bicameral Mind by Jameson. Yeah, just a thought. It is a type that is prone to regard itself as messianic, and whose best-known historical representative is Joan of Arc. Such seers of visions and dreamers of dreams as these are not, as a rule, thrown up by a civilization in which science is a popular possession, nor in one in which allegory is fully recognized to be a poet's legitimate presentation of truth that is too abstract for popular demonstration, but it is yet regarded as every man's possession and not as the prerogative of a favored few. When persons of an undisciplined imagination, unfamiliar with the wonders of science, are brought into contact with a highly symbolic art, and more especially with symbolic pantomime, their imagination is apt to become so excited that the symbols are played with, irrespective of their content of meaning, and fantastic visions are likely to be the result, whose interpretation, moreover, is jealously guarded by the dreamer as his personal prerogative. In ages past, the visionaries were almost bound to relate their dreams directly to religion. Today, we relate our dreams to personal problems of sex life or to politics. Such fantasias are a special feature of Jewish culture. They were made the vehicle for both moral and political teaching. They are completely absent from the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, whose mind, so far as we have any records of exhibiting it, was singularly well-balanced, sweet, and sane. He was the profundity of simplicity. If, as seems to me probable, he had drunk deeply of the ancient wisdom of the East, and was bent on revealing mankind's unity with God, he avoided both the adventitious aid of self-induced visions and dream fantasias, and the technicalities of scientific exposition. He was free from the egoistic possessiveness towards God of many of the Indian mystics, and also from the subtle mystification of the Chinese teachers who delight to speak in riddles while pretending to be quite as clear as a sunlit pool. Jesus of Nazareth, though he made no claims in that direction, was a natural poet. He spoke so simply of the profound truths he had to tell both Jews and Greeks were mystified and failed to perceive his meaning. What he spoke, however, he also lived, and there was no possible misunderstanding there. His life was the most perfect testimony to that compassion which, as I have tried to show, is a necessary expression of divine unity. If indeed Jesus of Nazareth had dwelt for a time in a community of Essenes, he had dipped deep into the well of ancient wisdom, and the water he drew up from it was pure and limpid, not muddied and obscured with extraneous matter, as was the teaching, insofar as it had been correctly reported of the Essenes. It may well be that the fashionable movement towards anchoritism that proved such a curious feature of 4th century Christianity owed something of the example of the Palestinian and Syrian Essenes, whose main social characteristic was their desire to live apart from the wicked world in a select backwater of their own, in which all men should be equal, having all things in common, and from which all that reminds man of war should be abolished. They feared also the lasciviousness, the elder Pliny's descriptions, not mine, of women. They did, however, teach and put into practice man's essential duty of cultivating the earth with his own hands. And Philo, the Jewish Alexandrian philosopher, who was a contemporary of Jesus of Nazareth, said of them that they condemn owners of slaves not only as unjust, inasmuch as they corrupt the principle of equality, but also as impious, because they destroy the law of nature, which, like a mother, brought forth and nourished all alike, and made them all legitimate brethren, not only in word, but in deed. And Philo pointed out that they considered that this relationship had been destroyed in the world at large by treacherous covetousness, which engendered enmity instead of cordiality, hatred instead of love. All who wrote about the Essenes were struck by their compassionateness. The life of Jesus, in as far as we know it from the gospel narratives, demonstrated clearly that the ideal of a spiritual ivory tower was, to him, incompatible with the divine compassion arising out of the unity of God and man. His teaching poured back into the empty vessel of Jewish written history the living stream of the ancient conviction of divine unity, and his life and his words overflowed with the conviction of divine compassion. It has been left to the organized Christian church to empty his teaching out of the creeds and to substitute for it the arid definitions of their councils. As if the poetry of his words, radiant with truth, could possibly be picked to pieces and set out on a blackboard in formula. Only his life and example seem to survive untouched by that deadening hand of doctrinal dictatorship, and if we wished to sum up these in one word, that word would almost certainly be compassion. He has passed on the torch kindled in the distant past of the ancient East, and the light he gave to men was one of the humblest and least erudite could see and recognize as truth. The writer of the 4th Gospel actually begins his book with the very words of the Vedic teaching. Prajapatir Vaidamasit, Tasya Vagdivityasit, Vagvai Paraman Brahma. In the beginning was Brahman, with whom was the word Vak, and the word is Brahman. He sought to show that the light, lighteth every man that cometh into the world, but that mankind did not always recognize the God in himself. But to as many as received that light, they became the sons of God. Jesus recognized that light and was the Word. It is indeed as though the entire panorama of the testimony of the wisdom of the ancient East were focused to a point in his teaching, as though a spotlight from the past were concentrated upon it, and upon its message of hope to the present, disunited and doubting world, sickened as it is by contemplation of modern mankind's insane inhumanity to man. The second Adam, the Son of Man, as he called himself, proclaimed himself the Son of God. That vision of the night of Daniel's, recounted in the 7th chapter in the book of Daniel, tells how mankind, the Son of Man, was ultimately given dominion in creation, but not until the fourfold cycle of manifestation had revolved, and the 10 divisions of time had been completed, did the saints of God triumph over discord and disruption. The vision was no doubt treasured by the Jews, as were the others in this book, because they saw in themselves the chosen people, the saints of God. Jesus of Nazareth, however, saw all humanity as the sons of God, and perhaps he came nearest to feeling that his mission had failed when he was attacked by the Jews for representing himself to be the king of the Jews, the Jewish Messiah. According to John's Gospel, he made it quite clear that humanity, the Son of Man, and not simply one race, must be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have eternal life. And then, according to John, came those words of deep understanding of the compassionate Father of the universe. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For every one that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may not be made manifest, that they are wrought in God. This Son was mankind. When the woman of Samaria spoke to him of the promised Savior, who both Samaritans and Jews believed would come to them, Jesus, having already told her that God was not in the Jerusalem of the Jews, or in the high place of the Samaritans, on Mount Gerizim, but was a spirit, and must be worshipped by mankind in spirit and in truth, and speaking always as the Son of Man, who is therefore the Son of God, he said, I that speak unto thee am he. He had told her that the water that he would give to his fellow men who thirsted for the truth would be a perennial source of living water in themselves, which would be the water of everlasting life. It must be remembered that the more thoughtful among both Orthodox Jews and dissenting Samaritans believed in a Messiah who, in the words of Dr. Moses Gaster, would bring peace to the world and unite mankind in the worship of the one God. Jesus no doubt knew that the Samaritans based their expectation on the tacheb, or restorer, on the words of Deuteronomy, book 18, chapter 18. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth. The messianic expectation of Jews and Samaritans developed in the atmosphere which, all over the ancient world, was becoming increasingly favorable to syncretistic religions, ideas during the 2 centuries BC. The more spiritual among the Jews thought of a savior who would unite mankind in the worship of the one God. The populace looked for a racial and a political deliverer. In either case, this gifted people looked for a savior who should vindicate Jewish religious leadership of the world. I have sometimes thought that the great teachers of religion have come always, where their particular emphasis on the central point of their own teaching was particularly needed. The unhappy result has been that, sooner or later, even the central truth of that teaching has been overwhelmed by the very failure to understand divine truth that the teacher himself sought to remedy. Jesus emphasized specifically the divine unity and its necessary concomitant, the brotherhood of man. Yet his own countrymen declared that he made himself out to be a racial leader, and they rejected him because of his universality. And the so-called universal church, founded by his followers, set itself up to make of him a spiritual dictator. What crimes against the free spirit of man have been committed by that church in his name? There have always been some who have understood his message, or part of it, and have claimed freedom of spirit in matters of belief, but have sought to show by their lives what he demonstrated by his, that the Son of Man is the Son of God, and that his divine unity is most truly manifested when compassio, fellow feeling, or suffering with, for mankind as a whole, is the direct fruit of the conviction of sonship. The age-old feeling of unity that the dawn civilization of Mesopotamia expressed, philosophically, by its scientific rationalization, and poetically by its image of the universal mother, was expressed with perfect simplicity by Jesus of Nazareth in the words recorded by John, "I and my Father am one." Let us forget, if we can, the sort of anthropological classification that stresses the importance of the difference between thinking of God as father and mother. There may be a difference in the angle of the human approach. There is none whatever in the one, regarded as progenitor and creator. Inevitably, nomads tend to make the effective head of the family the father. Almost inevitably, nomads then form a society that hunger makes predatory. It is therefore, to some extent, outcast, hence warlike. The Habiru, or Hebrews, before they came into Palestine, were such a people, though they obviously mingled with the population that had been there from prehistoric times. Although the whole of Syria from the earliest times had shared that conviction of the Sumerians, that the universe was one, and that the single divine law animating and controlling it was the expression of the one in the many, and although it had reverenced as the lady, Allat, the compassionate mother of all, nonetheless, this Hebrew tribe coming into southern Syria, anxious to preserve its independence and distinctive character, emphasized all those characters in its own ritual and religious poetry that glorified the one God as the special leader, protector, and the possession of the Hebrews. Any other way of regarding the divine one became to them an abomination. Their reaction against the mother goddess was particularly fierce. In consequence, even the most spiritually minded Jew came to think naturally of God as a Lord and as a Father, and perhaps to be incapable of forming in his mind the image of the Lady and Mother, without a sense of treachery to his own tribal religion. Thus early was the exclusiveness woven into the spiritual fiber of the Jew to be his glory and his curse through all his subsequent history to our own day. Wow, that's a very opinionated statement. Again, early 1940s writing. Yet the remedy was offered by one of his own race and utterly misinterpreted. So deeply did Jesus feel that he was man, everyman, and that he quietly and simply insisted again and again that he and his Father were one. When the Jews stoned him for it, he pointed out to them in their own law that it had been said of them, "Ye are gods." And when the word of God had spoken in them, he had asked them why they should run and say that he blasphemed when he too claimed to be the Son of God. "If I do not the works of my Father, believe me not," he said, and told them that, whether they believed what he said or not, they ought to credit the demonstration of his deeds, which should testify to his sonship. "That ye may know and believe that the Father is in me, and I in him." All who in these tragic days doubt whether mankind can really claim to have anything of God should hope again when they read those other words recorded of him. The Father loveth the Son, and hath given all things into his hand. He that believeth in the Son hath everlasting life. As parts of the divine whole, men have a part in the creative expression of the whole. They can accord with the divine whole, or they can utter discord, and thereby prevent the complete expression of the one in the many, which perfect expression is everlasting life, because it is a realization of God life, of universal life. Doing the works of the Father, having fellowship with mankind, compassion, is in fact expressing divine unity. The consciousness of law, or of harmonia, in this expression, seems to be the great contribution made by the very early civilization that flourished in Mesopotamia. The importance of that conception of taking part in creation, in uttering the word of the divine being, according to a law of music, might be guessed at, even if the whole thing had merely been a metaphor. When, however, the nature of the rediscovered harmonia is considered, that law seems to me to be wonderfully inspiring. The scale of musical intervals within the octave itself, a natural phenomenon which we are quite familiar, we are so familiar that we forget to wonder at it. Constituting the harmonia is likewise a natural one. Sound is the effect on the ear of motion communicated to a medium, such as the air, by some disturbance in it. Like light, it is one of the aspects under which motion is presented to our physical consciousness, but it is transmitted much more slowly, about 600 miles per hour through the air. It is transmitted like motion on the sea in waves. The characteristics of all wave motion, or vibration, is an apparent forward movement that is unshared by the medium itself. You can demonstrate the shiver by slowly agitating a carpet, or watching the movement of a float on the sea waves, demonstrating that the wave motion has this shape. Each completed pulsation occupies a definite period of time in traveling from one given point to another. Substitute an infinitesimal particle of water for the grossly visible cork, and you will understand the statement that during the time taken by an individual particle to perform a complete pulsation, the wave, and not the water, has moved forward one wavelength. This is what is meant by periodicity. Wavelengths are variable, but always in a strict proportion, a strict ratio, to the rate of vibration. The rate is inversely proportional to the corresponding length. Watch what happens when a field of standing corn, watch what happens to a field of standing corn when a gust of wind agitates it. The wave motion, or the oscillation, is set up by the air, behaves just as sound behaves. The diagram below provides a visual illustration of the extent of vibration of each individual particle, here represented by the ears of corn, of the medium through which motion is transmitted, that is, of the effective relative backwardness, or what is called retardation. The constant amount of retardation between a successive particle is precisely 1/8 of the period of a complete vibration. When the 9th particle of a supposed row of particles is just beginning its forward swing, its situation in an imaginary line of waves is exactly where the first was. Beyond this octave, there is mere repetition. Incidentally, the ancient Irish poem attributed to Amergin, the seer, preserved in certain medieval manuscript collections of allegories going back to the 4th century, makes use of this natural phenomenon under the image of the 9th wave to indicate the completion of one time cycle and the beginnings of a new one. The allegorical use by the Celtic Philae, professors of natural philosophy, poetry, and music, also known as Druids, of a physical phenomenon inherent in the nature of sound was probably a survival of traditional Eastern lore. Sound, its effect on the ear, is either musical or non-musical. The vibrations constituting non-musical sound are not constant. In those the ear recognizes as musical, equal numbers of equal vibrations take place in equal time amounts, giving a special pleasure to the ear. The musical quality is thus a result of number, and the great scientific discovery of the ancient East was that harmony, which is more easily analyzed in the comparatively slow pulse motion of sound than in any other natural phenomenon, is inseparable from number. From this fact, the seers of the ancient East deduced that the law of number, inherent in musical sound, was the law of the manifestation of the universe. What was this law of number that so impressed them? You have heard the rise in pitch of the note as a started-up engine turns faster and faster. You may not realize that the scale of sounds is actually continuous. It is an infinite harmonic series. If you've taken your ideas of pitch from a piano, because the arbitrary scale to which a piano is tuned is not merely a series of jumps of a half tone each, but it is not even numerically accurate to a half tone. It is tempered, as they say. It is possible to measure the number of vibrations of any note in this series per second, and that is in the sexagesimal interval of time that is measured relative to the motions of the heavenly bodies first detected and standardized by the Sumerians. On those from which they acquired, or from those they acquired their civilization and their units. Below the rate of 16 vibrations per second, 16 hertz, it is impossible for the ear to recognize the musical character of a note. The lowest traditional musical note is considered to be around 40 hertz. The extreme range of the human singing voice, from the deepest bass to the highest soprano, is from about 50 to 1,500 cycles per second. Very likely in the ancient East, the ideal musical range may have been reckoned as beginning at 60 and ending at 3,600. If some musical sound be arbitrarily chosen as a keynote, or source note, or arche in the Greek, certain other notes, having fixed relations of pitch with that keynote, form with it and with one another vibrational effects definitely pleasurable to the ear. This interrelationship is based on number. It is the accurate numerical proportion, or ratio, of the intervals subsisting between the vibrational rates of these notes that constitutes their physically appreciable aesthetic quality. The outstanding interval is the octave. The peculiar smoothness of the sounds made by the 8th, 16th, 24th, and 32nd notes above or below any selected note when sounded with that note is appreciable even to the least cultivated ear. This is the effect called unison. The ratio of 8th to 1st notes is 2 to 1. During one cycle of time, the number of vibrations made by the 8th is exactly double the number made by the 1st or tonic. The musical quality of unison is therefore something in the realm of physics, translated into the realm of biology, which the mind of man again translates into the spiritual realm of intellectual perception of beauty. That is how we should put it. The wisdom of the East would simply claim that there are not 3 realms, but one, and that the same self-similar law operates throughout the unity, which to us seems multiple. Its wise men thought deeply about this number 8 and about the ratio 2 to 1, and they came to the conclusion that the peculiar comprehensiveness of the octave must reside in some archetypical arrangement in the manifestation of being. Within the limits of the octave, there are 7 arithmetically logical intervals that likewise appealed to them as archetypal. The arbitrarily formed scales with which the West is familiar are built up from a series of 11 sounds, inclusive of the 8th note or natural octave, which combined with the tonic yield the 10 intervals of the major and minor scales, of which the most familiar are those known as the minor and major thirds, having interval ratios of 6 to 5 and 5 to 4. The 5th, with a ratio of 3 to 2, and the octave, with its ratio of 2 to 1. Our piano scale has 12 equal semitones within its octave, obtained by sacrificing the just intonation of every single note. The result of this falseness is disagreeably magnified by the modern sensitive radio in the effort the ear has to make to accommodate the confused harmonics is as fatiguing as the effort made by the eye to accommodate itself to the unnatural frequencies of uncorrected electric light. I love that statement. Ultimately, the justness of the ear's sensibility is blunted, and it accepts false intonations as though they were true. The history of music and philosophy alike tell of another set of ancient scales known as the seven Harmoniae, the degrees of which, so the followers of Pythagoras, the harmonists, taught represented interval ratios that were basic in nature, and, as Aristotle said, depended on a number and equal measure. Strange as it may seem, this basis has been a lost secret for centuries, and musicologists who have specialized in Greek music, including many Greek authors, have put forward various hypotheses. None of them have satisfied this Aristotelian condition, since none of them have been both mathematically and aesthetically logical. Attention was drawn to Aristotle's statement by one of the best-known contemporary authorities on Greek music, who is also the leading expert in the archaeology and musical technology of woodwind instruments, the English musicologist Miss Kathleen Schlesinger. She rediscovered the arithmetical basis of the harmonia and has shown how this basis is automatically recorded in ancient reed-blown pipes when their finger holes are equidistantly placed, and their distance apart constitutes an aliquot part of the total length of pipe plus mouthpiece. This is the obvious consequence of a natural physical law, but nobody else had happened to realize the connection, perhaps because they were not seeking it. Knowing where to look is half the battle in research. Physicists have long known that for each musical note there exists a corresponding air column of definite length that selectively resounds to that note, and the maximum resonance in a closed tube is produced by a note precisely an octave below of the maximum resonance of that cylinder of the same dimension on open ends. Blowing into the tube compresses the air and sets up an oscillatory motion consisting of alternate condensations and reactionary rarefactions, like the shiver of the corn stalks. Their combined wavelength has a definite ratio to the length of the tube or cylinder containing the air column. This broad physical acoustic principle underlies the complicated laws involved in the production of the simplest woodwind instruments. Miss Schlesinger found that equal measure, as Aristotle put it, in the dimensions of the pipe or air resonator and in the distance apart of its finger holes automatically yielded logical and mathematically natural scales of interval ratios which, thanks to her study of all the relevant available ancient texts, she has been able to identify with the lost aulos harmoniae. This modal system of the harmonists was in use contemporaneously with the non-modal ditonal system from which the modern musical scales derive. This is how Miss Schlesinger describes it. The harmonia among the Greeks was a sequence consisting of proportional interrelated ratios within the octave, and the sequence itself was based upon natural law. 7 original harmoniae may be found differentiated within the same octave, each having an individual and independent genesis from a common fundamental note, believed to be F. Since these 7 harmonia are found differentiated within the octave F to F, each having the characteristic order of intervals resulting from its own independent genesis, it follows that there must be, for the second step, 7 Gs, according to modern nomenclature, all differing in intonation and bearing to the common tonic Fs a different ratio. There will likewise be 7 As, Bs, Cs, Ds, and Es, fulfilling similar conditions. As a natural consequence of this, there will be 7 different sequences starting from the same tonic F, no 2 of which will begin with the same interval. The interval from the first to second steps is, therefore, indicative of the particular harmonia. This sevenfold differentiation is unobtainable with tones and semitones only. The ear could fix these intervals, and the primitive piper could, and doubtless did, acquire the different modes by ear from his pipe or aulos. But it needed a highly educated person to discover the mathematical basis underlying these modes. It has been generally assumed that the theory of the harmoniae, whatever that may be, was either a Greek discovery or a secret learned by the Greek harmonists from Egyptian mathematicians. It is certain that the Egyptian religious philosophy was an adaptation of an older religious philosophy borrowed from the land between the two rivers, perhaps through Syria. In their return or rebirth of the sun ritual recorded in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the 7 musical tones, uttered, chanted, or played on a reed pipe by Thoth, the word of Ptah, the heart of the creator-maintainer of the universe, played a prominent part. Miss Schlesinger assures me that the ancient silver pipes recently discovered from the Mesopotamian afford irrefutable evidence of the use by the people of Ur, of Chaldees, of these harmonia scales. From my own study of the cosmological system of that people, as it is revealed in their poetical allegories, and based as it is on number, I have no doubts whatever that the ultimate source of the religious philosophy of the scales of the Greek harmonists was Mesopotamia, or the as yet unknown source where the Sumerians and the peoples of the Indus Valley alike drew their culture. The modal numbers of the 7 harmoniae, determinant by reason of being, let us say, an 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, or 14th, aliquot part of a string, or a segment of the sound box of a monochord, also denote the member of the infinite harmonic series, bearing the same number, because this harmonic happens to be the fundamental note sounded by plucking the first aliquot part of the string. It is the arche, or source of the series of musical ratios of its mode. Take 14, which Miss Schlesinger has identified as the arche of the Mixolydian harmonia. Rounding up the ratios of the harmonic series to 14 on the F string, tuned to 176 vibrations per second, we get 1/14th. If now a series of exactly proportionate interval ratios be taken in descending order, the result is a sequence from 1/14th to 14/14ths. When this sequence is played in an ascending scale from the tone of the whole string, the flatness of the arche imparts its flatness as harmonic 7th to every note except the string and its octaves. I have here used the illustration given by Miss Schlesinger on a string because it demonstrates the logical sequence of the intervals of the harmoniae, and also what it is that determines them. Actually, in the aulos, or the pipe, it is the ascending harmonia that come to birth. The ascending harmonia is a series of consecutive sounds beginning on the note of the whole pipe with holes closed. This proportionate sequence on a string begins with the note of the whole string as tonic, and the scale can be built up by stopping each segment in turn and sounding the remainder of the string. In the pipe, it can be done by uncovering each hole in turn while blowing through the mouthpiece. When that portion of the tube below the center of the open hole is cut off from resounding, and the resonance is obtained only from the portion from the open hole to the top of the mouthpiece. The scale runs itself from 14/14ths, or totality, to 7/14ths, or the octave above, which is half the length of the string, or nominally, not actually, half the length of the pipe plus its mouthpiece. This 7th degree was known to the Greeks as mesi, and it is always one of the lower octaves of arche. The relation between arche, or source note, and tonic, whole string, or total tube note, in this natural gamut is reflected by the relation between mesi and tonic, and gives the characteristic modal interval of each harmonia expressed by ratios consisting of 8, or of one of its multiples, and of the modal determinant number. The Hypodorian scale, ratio 16:8, unison or octave. The Mixolydian scale, ratio 14:8, the harmonic seventh, the Lydian scale, ratio 13 to 8, the flat major sixth, the Phrygian, 24 to 16, the perfect fifth, Dorian, 11 to 8, the sharp harmonic fourth, Hypolydian, 20 to 16, the major third, and Hypophrygian, 36 to 32, the major tone. In every harmonia, mesi is recognizable by ear as an octave of archi. The scale itself has a double origin, one in the infinite harmonic series through the numerical position in this series of archi, the source note, and two, in aliquot division by that number. Much else logically flows from this, but our technical digression, though necessary, is already long enough. You're telling me. Those who desire to follow up the matter should go to Miss Schlesinger's learned book, on which she was at work for over a score of years, and which gives all the details a classical scholar, a musicologist, a mathematician, an acoustician, or a musician might demand. She herself believes that the rediscovered modal system holds the germ of the future development of the art of music. Each of these 7 modes, having its separate acoustical character that is quite distinctive, imparts this distinction to any melody played in that mode. So it is seen that the claims of the harmonists were not exaggerated, and the stories told by Greek authors about the psychological influence of the different modes are evidently trustworthy and based on scientific fact. 49 sets of sequences grouped in 7 modes give wide tonal scope. A fresh use of these modes might indeed give us that something new and physically satisfying to the ear that the human mind seeks in musical language. It would not be atonality, but true tonality. When the new goes contrary to nature's laws, it is always fatiguing, if not positively irritating. I do not think I am going too far in suggesting that the recent experimentation into extremes of music, atonal chord sequences without melodic line, and a despairing return to the only half-assimilated primitive rhythms and sequences of African and Hawaiian traditional folk song, again a dated statement, are symptomatic of the total loss of the sense of unity and logical progression that afflicts Western civilization today. That which gave the Harmonia their religio-philosophic importance was the demonstration they provided that musical, shall we say measured, sound, in a special sense, was the utterance of the divine unity in the manifold manifestation that we call the cosmos. These inevitable sequences of ratios forming constituent parts of a whole were the expression in sound of arrhythmos, number, in a different sphere. They expressed the correspondences of equal measure and of number, as they occurred in music with equal measure and number in the domain of space-time. It was no wonder that God, playing an aulos or pipe, in later times a side-blown flute, became the favorite anthropomorphic figure for the divine creator in cosmic poems for dramatic representation. Orpheus had his forerunner in India, and all such figures had their prototype in Mesopotamia. The popular representation of the mother goddess with her kitara, dating from the 6th century BC onwards, or that of Apollo with his, were only adaptations in which the reason for the aulos, being the harmonia originating instrument, was ignored, the theory of the 7 natural scales having become an esoteric tradition even by then. Nonetheless, the natural scales themselves survived wherever equal measure, as I've described it, was embodied in the pipe itself. Nor was it extraordinary that in the ancient East the number 7, no less than the number 8, stood for creation, 8 as a comprehensive whole, and especially as a completed cycle, and 7 as the very expression of a differentiation that was yet contained within and itself built up a unity. These harmoniae, as embodiments of a fundamental law of nature, could not but deeply influence the evolution, that concept of unity, in which the one and the many expressed a single whole. The unity was seen to consist in some compelling archetypical law of number, in which membership of a whole is not haphazard but inevitably proportionate. The parts are essential structural components of the totality. The totality has no being except through the expression of their parts, and the individual parts have no being except by reason of their mutual relation with both the totality and with the other parts. This fitting together, or harmonia, came to express for thoughtful minds the truth about the manifestation of the One, which they realized could only become manifest through its manifold character. It summed up mankind as it summed up all nature. The responsible dignity of men's minds and wills was felt to consist not specifically in their differences from one another, but in the variety of their characteristic individuality, thrown into relief precisely by their mutual relation and their unity as component differentiated parts of one whole. Subject to this relativity, men's minds were free to will what they could, and to know as much as they were capable of conceiving. Yet, the creative power of each individual mind resided ultimately in its mutual relation with others, and with the one whole, of which each mind was a reflecting facet. It was freedom within a pattern, not prearranged, because prearrangement was a time concept meaningless apart from serialization, but a natural pattern. The music that men could help but make, if I may so put it, was tonal, because only within the widely various tonal patterns could the individual note express its full musical value or have any meaning. The concept of unity, human and divine, became one that was rooted in a relativity mutually conditioned to form a pattern. That was why ratio, in the sense of proportion, seemed to these early thinkers to be the very essence of divine power and beauty. Modern science has revealed such inherent pattern-forming growth in the intimate structure of an atom, in the crystal, which is likely to prove to be the intimate structure of all matter. Yet nothing in nature transcends the significance and beauty of the demonstration of this inherent mutuality according to the law in the harmonia of musical sound. That the principle underlying the natural harmoniae was known to the civilization flourishing in Sumer and Akkad, and was there regarded as the basis in the evolution of creation, considered as musical utterance, seems to me indubitable. The cosmic allegories of ancient Mesopotamia and the allegoric personages of the creation drama in the Vedic hymns strongly suggest it. The exquisiteness of such a law must have powerfully stimulated the imagination of those who first discovered it, and of those who fell heir to that knowledge. It practically compelled those who knew about it to take musical sound as the perfect expression of the difficult fact presented to man's understanding in what we know as creation. It also made it inevitable that all worship should be done with measured or rhythmic words, poetry, and with song and instrumental music. Once we are in possession of this key to the symbolism of religious poetry and art in the ancient East, from which Greece inherited so much, we find that it will unlock many doors that have been stubbornly closed. It gives meaning to the old Greek teaching about the harmony of the spheres, although late Greek explanations seem rather puerile. The peoples of Mesopotamia had noted the revolution times of the planets, and although they erroneously related all movements through the zodiac to the Earth as the center instead of the sun, they were wonderfully accurate in such time observations as they were able to make without elaborate scientific instruments. Like Bodhi, they must have been struck by the relationship existing between the heavenly bodies. They did not know of magnetism. Do we ourselves know very much about it? They did know of ratio, and I infer that they knew of the harmoniae. They were convinced that the same law of ratio that operates in those natural musical scales operated also in another medium, in the heavens. Would Faraday have discovered all that he did if he had not been convinced that a universal law was at work throughout nature? Or would Newton? Is it possible that the ancient thinkers divined something here that we ourselves have yet to discover? We know that the scientific knowledge of the harmoniae died out. The Greeks themselves propounded all sorts of other more or less arbitrary systems of scales, and they theorized about them. And here I would emphasize the point Miss Schlesinger insists on, that her own attribution of the Harmoniae and other musical systems to the Greeks signifies only that Greece alone of the ancient civilizations left evidence in literary sources such as treatises on music, and more importantly still, perhaps, in musical notation. This evidence will always be comparatively readily available to the general public. Greek musical terms have been transmitted to us by medieval musicians, hence the legend that it was the Greeks who invented the systems is likely to survive and to deceive many. The Sumerian scientific rationalization of all measures, based on a religious concept of differentiated unity, also fell to pieces in later times when its basis was no longer remembered. In brief, they symbolized the created universe by the arc of 120 cubits on a side. It had its actual musical counterpart in the cubed foot, or jin, Greek mana, mentioned above. It seems certain that the name mana or mena was derived from the Semitic word meaning to count or allot, from cut off or to measure. It was understandable, therefore, that this verb should be embodied in one of the many titles of Ishtar, the Lady of Heaven, who was both manifester of the god One as mother and was represented by the planet Venus because it was the precursor or the herald of the sun, the supreme symbol of the law of unity, as well as by the moon, the measurer, the time regulator. Understandable, too, is that one of her earliest representations would have been the stone cube, the Kaaba. From that cubic measure, as standard, Mesopotamia derived all other measures, including those of capacity and time, since the contents and weight of that cube in water, poured out from one measured vessel into another, were the origin of the water clock, gave them their measured interval of time. This, in turn, was related to the apparent diameter of the sun and the moon on the horizon, which gave them the degree, and to the time that the sun took to accomplish its journey, or year, of 360 night days. Lunar days, which had to be discarded later in measuring actual time, for solar days in order to fit in those tiresome 5 1/4 extra ones. This numerical system, however, with its 360 night days, was retained, the so-called sexagesimal system, resting on multiplication of the natural number 10. They say natural because all counting must have been done on the fingers by the number 6. A great deal of jugglery with the properties of numbers was indulged in by speculative men as time went on. But a scale based on 10 and 6, dictated by practical considerations, equated with reasoned thought, based on the discovered existence of a unifying law, seems to have been the foundation of their system, a solid and 4 square as the cube and its 6 faces themselves. The playing with number, however, was not entirely fantastic. Originally, it had a scientific interest, and through this rationalization, number was actually related to other facts of existence, such as the motions of the heavenly bodies, and, as I have tried to show, the musical harmonia. Who could tell how much else might also be implicated? That, one might suppose, was the starting point of much of the numerical speculation, and also of astrology. Once such speculations were divorced from the scientific scheme out of which they were built, they could not fail but lead to extravagances and fantasia. If, however, a sympathetic examination is to be made of the ancient systems of cosmology with any hope of understanding their symbolization, this foundation of number and measure must ever be kept in mind. For example, the manner in which the divine being, manifesting in time, is represented by the tetrachus, 4, in which creation, as utterance, is represented by the octave. 6 and 10 also are used as symbols for time extension. The notion of even numbers as yin, or female, and odd numbers as yang, or male, is also quite reasonably based on certain musical facts connected with octave ratios. Cubing numbers also is seen to have a symbolic force when related to the rationalization scheme. Any learned reader can work this out for themselves. The Pythagoreans laid great stress on ratios. A study of the sequence of the rediscovered Harmonia ratios will reveal why they did so in the first place, and perhaps more convincingly than the explanations of the Neo-Pythagoreans. That was the third chapter from the book Manifold Unity, the Ancient World's Perception of the Divine Pattern of Harmony and Compassion. And having read that third chapter just now, I will reread the introductory poem. If you're still with me through all this poem may now have new meaning for you. It is called The Heart of the Lotus is One. Om, so chanted in parable, the ancient Indian seers, is the threefold basic vibration, the musical sound, to be, being, and ceasing from being. Unfolding as a lovely flower, 8-petaled, an octave of consequential notes, 7 the grades, the interlocking ratios, the fellowship linking the many in the one with the bond of brotherhood, of a common father as sons. They said as they chanted solemnly is the sound of building up. They said is the sound of breaking down. And is the bridging sound of serialization. Sustaining, extending, holding in balance the ebb and flow of being's course, the yang and yin, as the Chinese poets called it, the relation between what we know as time, space, or as consciousness, enabling the I to conceive a thou. Gayatri, the Indian sages called this measure, the bird Gayatri, swift hawk, flight of the eagle to the sun, bearer of the plant of continued life, from generation to generation, spanning time, said they who hummed this mantra sound, seeking thus to demonstrate the wheel of the law of progression. Within the cause lies the effect, within the I, the seed of thou, within that inconceivable, the limitless, eternal, lies time, space, what is and what is not, the germ of generation. The heart that speaks, the Egyptian seers called it, that utters the word we know as creation, Thoth they named it, tongue and messenger, executive of the power to be. 8-petaled lotus, city of the 8, octave of potentiality, all things containing, maintaining, and at the end, resuming. Lovely Harmonia's musical manifestation, source and sum of number, father and mother of doing, being, and knowing. Within thy cup, O flower, those seers saw enshrined the golden seed of being's cycle. Verily, they sang, the heart of this lotus is one. Thank you for watching, my friends.